story was submitted to me by a follower who would like to remain anonymous. When I was 14, I had a best friend named Lucy, and we had one of those friendships where we were really close really quickly, which I now know is a red flag and usually a sign of a toxic friendship. But I was too young to know this then. Our favorite thing to do together was hang out at the mall. Our parents would let us go alone as long as we abided to one rule. We had to stay together at all times, and we were always pretty good about that. One night we were having a sleepover at Lucy's house and her Uncle Mike came over for dinner. Uncle Mike was pretty loud and goofy. He showed us like 8 magic tricks that night. I liked him. He was fun. But as I was helping clear dishes after dinner, I overheard Mike and Lucy's mom having a hushed conversation in the kitchen. She was like, "You've had too much to drink. Why don't you just spend the night?" So Mike ended up sleeping over that night too. Right before going to sleep, Lucy's mom came into the bedroom and she told us to remember to shut the bedroom door before falling asleep. When I asked Lucy why she said that, Lucy just shrugged and said, "I don't know." But we made sure the bedroom door was shut just like she asked. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the feeling of someone tickling my feet. So I was having a sleepover at Lucy's house and I woke up in the middle of the night to someone or something tickling my feet. I scream and then I hear shuffling. Lucy wakes up and she's like, "What's wrong?" And I tell her that something was tickling my feet, but she doesn't believe me. I'm like, "Well, why is the door open? We shut it before we went to sleep." And she goes, "Relax. Sometimes it happens because there's a draft in the house." And I tell her that I think it was her uncle who was tickling my feet and she goes, "Oh, come on, you're hallucinating." And honestly, at the time I had a bad feeling about Lucy's reaction. It felt like she was gaslighting me and I had no idea why. A few weekends later, Lucy and I are chilling at the mall on a Saturday afternoon. My parents let us go to the mall together alone, but their one rule is that we have to stay together the whole time. They call it the buddy system. So that day, Lucy's acting weird. She keeps looking around nervously and checking her phone. She says she has to go to the bathroom and I'm like, "Okay, I'll go with you." Because we always go together even if the other person didn't have to pee. And Lucy's like, "No, I'll go alone. I'll be quick." And I'm like, "No, I'll just go with you." And she snaps really aggressively and she's like, "Just stay here." And then she spins around and sprints away from me. So Lucy's running away from me in the mall. I sprint after her. She's super fast. She rounds the corner and then I can't find her after that. I start crying. I have no idea why my best friend ran away from me. So I sit down on a bench in the mall. I'm still crying, really overwhelmed. Then I hear someone say my name. So I look up and it's Lucy's uncle, Uncle Mike. He asks what's wrong and I tell him. He's being super nice and comforting. And then he starts rubbing my back, which made me uncomfortable, but I don't say anything. Then he offers to give me a ride home. And I say, "No, I can just call my parents." And he goes, "Just let me give you a ride, come on." But the way he said it the second time gave me goosebumps. It was aggressive. Like he wasn't asking me, he was telling me. So I stand up and step away from him and say, "You're making me uncomfortable. I'm calling my parents." Mike glares at me and then he says, "No one likes a tease." And he walks away. I told my parents what happened and they immediately called Lucy's parents. Apparently, Uncle Mike had taken a liking to me and he found out that I was going to be at the mall that day with Lucy and Mike paid her $100 to run away and leave me alone with him. He told Lucy that I liked him too and that she was being a good friend by giving us alone time. I never spoke to Lucy again after that. So there's this lighthouse that you can see from my house and my mom used to tell me a story about a woman who used to live there. No one lives in it now, but there used to be this young woman in her 20s who lived there like 30 years ago. Apparently she came from a really broken home. Her mom and sister died in a horrible car crash and her dad was an abusive drug addict. So the harbor master let her live in the lighthouse and paid her a small salary for taking care of it. So she had been living there for a couple months and that's when she noticed weird things starting to happen. Some of her belongings would occasionally go missing. Like one time she couldn't find her flashlight and she looked for it everywhere. And finally she found it under her bed, which was weird because she knew she had never put it there. But then weirder stuff started to happen. So at this point, she had been living at the lighthouse for like 6 months, and she was getting pretty creeped out because bizarre things started happening. She started noticing that some of her food was going missing, but she was the only person who lived in the lighthouse, obviously, and she was really specific about what food she bought when she went grocery shopping. She went to the grocery store at the beginning of each week, and for example, she would always buy 7 apples, 1 for each day of the week, and she was always really precise about that. But there were a few Sundays where she didn't have any apples left by the end of the week, which didn't make any sense because she always counted at the grocery store to make sure she had 7 apples. So she started getting more and more creeped out, but she didn't want to say anything because she had nowhere else to live. And then one night she woke up in the middle of the night to something touching her feet at the end of her bed. So she woke up in the middle of the night to something tickling her feet and she was really freaked out, obviously. So she jumped out of bed and turned all the lights in the lighthouse on. But when the lights came on, there was nothing there. She checked through the whole lighthouse and couldn't find anything. Nothing like that ever happened again, but she never slept well after that. She stayed in the lighthouse for like 5 more months, but eventually she found a new place to live, got a new job. She ended up moving to an entirely different state. And then one day, like a year later, she's at work, sitting at her desk, and she's going through old pictures on her phone. And she finds an album on her phone called You at Night. And she's thinking, what? I do not remember making this album. So she clicks into it and she gasps because all the pictures in the album are of her sleeping in her old bed at the lighthouse. One summer after my sophomore year of college, I was working on an organic farm in Switzerland. But the farm was in this really remote area, so every few days I had to go to the closest town to run errands. But I didn't have a car or anything, so I would hitch rides. And even though hitchhiking is usually a pretty sketchy thing to do as a single woman in a foreign country, I normally felt pretty safe, except for this one time. I was on my way back to the farm and I had hitched a ride on a motorcycle. And then this other guy on a motorcycle came up next to us and was trying to tell me something. And it's super windy, obviously, so I can't hear anything. And we were going like 40 miles per hour on these tiny roads. He's holding a necklace in his other hand that he's like dangling around. I'm like, no, I don't want the necklace. I don't have any cash on me. But he kept following us and trying to sell it. So finally we get to the spot where I'm supposed to be dropped off. And this guy's been following us for like 30 minutes. And from the place where I'm dropped off, it's still a 10-minute walk to the farm. And the sun is setting, it's getting dark. So I start walking and this guy keeps following me. And I start to get this really bad feeling. So I'm getting worried about this guy following me. So I turn to him and say, all I have is $2 American. And that was true. I actually only had $2 in cash on me at that time. And he keeps repeating this word that I don't understand. Oh, pal. That's what he keeps saying over and over again. So I pull out the $2 and I look at him and I'm like, this is all I have. And he's like, okay. And he gives me the necklace and I give him the $2. And I'm not even sure if he'll leave me alone at this point, but after I buy the necklace, he turns around and starts walking away. So I'm really relieved. Obviously, I look at the necklace. I can barely see it because it's dark. And when I finally get back to the farm, I have dinner and then I go to bed. And while I'm getting ready for bed, I'm emptying my pockets and I look more closely at the necklace. And I realize it's actually really pretty. It's like a white iridescent gem, and I look it up and I realize it's probably an opal, which would make sense because opal sounds a lot like the word the guy kept repeating. So I decide to wear it because I actually really like it. So I put it on and then I go to bed. But in the middle of the night, I wake up to something I'd never experienced before. So I wake up and it feels like the whole house is shaking. And I start freaking out, but suddenly it stops completely. And normally in the middle of the night, there are a lot of animal noises on the farm, but everything was silent. So the next morning, I find out that it was an earthquake, which is pretty uncommon for that area. And when the sun comes out, we actually see that the earthquake caused some legitimate damage. There was a little shed on the property that had fallen apart, and we spent the rest of the day rebuilding it. But then more and more weird stuff started to happen. Like the next day, for example, the farm had this little pond of koi fish, and all of a sudden they all died. We found them all floating, like 20 of them, belly up. It looked like they had gotten poisoned or something, but we couldn't figure out how. And then like 4 days later, something even worse happened. The farm had this really cute dog named Chicken, who would always be hanging around, but then went missing for like 2 days. So after a couple days, we decided to go look for Chicken in the rainforest. We all decided to go look for him separately in different directions, and I'm probably searching for like an hour, and then I hear something rustling in the bushes, and I find Chicken. But normally Chicken's super friendly, but he's like growling at me and baring his teeth, and his eyes look really weird, like they're going in different directions. But I managed to put the leash on him, and we start walking. I find the other people. We decide to go back to the house. We make dinner. We're happy the Chicken's safe. So we're eating dinner, and Chicken starts shaking uncontrollably. He's whimpering, he's having a seizure, and then he dies right in front of us. It was horrible. So the next day we have to bury Chicken. But then 2 weeks after we bury him, all the arugula on the farm dies. And more little things start going wrong too. And it just got so bad that I decided to go home early, back to the US. And on my flight home, I had the worst turbulence I've ever had on a flight. Like the person next to me was vomiting. It was the worst plane ride I had ever been on. So I get back to Boston and I'm at baggage claim, and there's this old woman who's also at baggage claim who keeps giving me nasty looks. So I'm trying to avoid eye contact, but then she comes over and she tries to talk to me. And she goes, your necklace. And she points to my necklace. She goes, opal. That's an evil necklace. She goes, you should not wear that at airports. And I'm like, okay, I don't know what to say back to her. And then I get home and I take a shower and I take off the necklace. But when I get out of the shower, I hesitate before I put the necklace back on. So I go to my phone and I Google meaning of opal. And I found on Wikipedia that opals are sometimes known as demon stones, and that the stone is associated with bad luck. In Russia, the stone symbolizes an evil eye, and anyone wearing it or associated with the stone also is evil themselves. Whoops. So now that opal necklace is somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean because that's where I threw it. I took a class in college called Women's Reproductive Health. I took it instead of a really fun sociology lecture that all my friends were taking called Demystifying the Hipster. That was the actual name of the class. I was like, why would I spend an entire semester trying to debunk the mystery of white men who do improv? Like, okay, they don't need to be lifted up. They're already boldly creating art with one-word suggestions from the audience. But I'm also a feminist. And I told my friends, I said, I'm not taking Demystifying the Hipster with you guys. Instead, I'm taking Women's Reproductive Health. Because women's studies does not get the academic attention it deserves, and I want to actively be a part of changing that. Also, at the time, I did in fact need a science credit, and it was the only class that fit into my schedule. One of the craziest things I learned in the class was about the study done in Argentina. I took a class in college called Women's Reproductive Health. One of the craziest things I learned in the class was about the study done in Argentina that revealed that the rate of C-sections performed by male doctors spikes in the hours before the Argentinian soccer team plays. Because natural births, as we know, can take like 20 hours. And C-sections are relatively very fast. You can just cut the mother open and boom, there's your baby. So a doctor can just perform the C-section, be done with the delivery, wash his hands, hurry over to the bar, and catch the game. The magic of medicine. And listen, I was a college athlete, I'm from Boston, and I do believe sports are incredibly fun and a deeply important part of our culture. I just think men have the tendency to take it a little too far. Like, for example, when Argentinian male doctors sedate and cut open pregnant women so they don't have to miss the game. But I don't know, maybe that's just me. I used to work at a consulting company, and a few years ago I went on a work trip with 4 of my colleagues to visit a client in Miami. It was me, this guy David, and then our 2 bosses, Melissa and Rick. David and I were both younger people at the company, and then Melissa and Rick were both senior, and we reported to them. So we would do our work during the day with our clients, and then at night we usually had dinner all together. And at dinner people were typically having a lot of fun, everyone got a little tipsy. So on the second night at dinner I noticed that David, the coworker who's my age, keeps glancing at our boss Melissa really flirtatiously. So I start subtly observing them more, and I notice that Melissa keeps touching David's shoulder and laughing at all of his bad jokes. And Melissa is not only our boss, but she is married with a kid. So it is very shocking to see Melissa flirting with David, who's like 20 years younger than she is. But I also think maybe I'm reading into things, maybe they're not flirting, because they both would definitely be losing their jobs if they were having any sort of affair. But the next day, things escalated. So I keep seeing my boss, Melissa, and my coworker, David, flirting with each other on our work trip in Miami. And Melissa is much older than David, and she's married with kids. After all of our dinners, they stay at the bar, just the 2 of them talking. So I start to think that something is definitely up. And honestly, I don't really even want to know what's going on because I don't want to get in trouble with the company. So the last night, all 4 of us stay after dinner and get a drink at the bar. And David ends up going up to his hotel room early because he gets hammered. And then my other boss, Rick, goes up shortly after because he's tired. So it's just me and Melissa at the bar finishing our drinks. And as we're finishing our drinks, Melissa asks me if she can see my hotel room, which I think is weird, but I'm like, sure. So we go up and it's pretty awkward. She looks around, she's like, oh, it looks just like mine, and then she leaves. 3 weeks later, we're all back in the office and I get a call from Melissa's husband. I've only met him briefly once before at a company party, and I can tell over the phone that he's upset, like his voice is shaking a bit. And he tells me that Melissa's been acting very strange and different ever since our trip to Miami. She's been saying things like she's rethinking everything, she's not sure if she's happy anymore, everything has changed, and he wants to know what happened in Miami. And I'm honest with him. I tell him, as far as I can tell him, nothing happened, but Melissa and David did appear to be very close over the trip. So he says thank you and tells me not to tell Melissa that he called me. A week later, I get a text from Melissa asking me if I want to go camping. And I'm like, oh, with other colleagues on like a retreat? And she says, no, just the 2 of us. And I find this bizarre and uncomfortable, so I come up with an excuse for why I can't go camping. And then she's like, all right, we'll want to get drinks after work tonight. And Melissa's my direct boss, so of course I'm going to say yes to that. We meet for drinks, she orders water, and I get a glass of wine. And after a little bit of small talk, she announces that she's pregnant and that I'm the first person she's telling. And I'm like, oh wow, congrats. And then she says, but I'm about to leave my husband. And I start to get nervous, like she's gonna tell me that she's having an affair with David. And again, I really just don't want to know about any of it, but that's not what she tells me. She instead tells me that she has developed feelings for me over the past couple months. She says that ever since our work trip to Miami, she can't stop thinking about me and she thinks she's in love. I'm like, what about David? And she goes, what about David? I was only using him to get close to you.
Story time about how my boyfriend was plotting to kill me. So this was around my senior year in high school. Me and my friend Jessica were out at this restaurant and we ran into this really cute dude. My friend Jessica was like, girl, you should go over there and talk to him. Now, I usually didn't do this, but for this one, I made an exception. So I went over and asked his name. He told me his name was Mike. He was so charming and we exchanged numbers instantly. Now, we only exchanged numbers after talking for about 10 minutes. Once I got cool vibes from him, it was a wrap. Once I went back to my friend Jessica, I was so excited that I actually got his number and we started to text immediately. So I went home and we were texting and I was telling him about the school that I went to and just basic conversation. We texted all day into the night. So the next day, he took me on a date and we went to this really nice restaurant. So that next Monday came around, I ran into Jessica and was telling her how much fun we had. That Monday at school, I ran into Jessica and she looked so disturbed, like for part 2. This is part 2 about how my boyfriend was plotting to kill me. So like I said in part 1, I ran into Jessica that Monday at school and she looked so disturbed for some reason. I was like, hey girl, we had so much fun on our date. What's wrong? She was like, girl, Mike is here. I don't know why she looked so disturbed. I was excited to find out he was going to our school. But once I told her how happy I was about it, she was happy for me. So to fast forward the story, I was spending the night at his house more often and we started going to school together. But I definitely noticed something was off when I would go to sleep. Anytime I woke up in the middle of the night to check my phone or to go use the restroom, I would notice he was just up staring at me in the bed. This gets crazy, like for part 3. Part 3 about how my boyfriend was plotting to kill me. So like I said in part 2, I noticed stuff was kind of weird. Every time I woke up to check my phone, he was always up in the bed just staring at me. So one morning, I set my alarm 30 minutes earlier than I usually do so I can get up for school earlier. I noticed he wasn't in the bed, so I'm using my flashlight and I'm just walking around the room, looking in the closet, trying to find out where he went. So I checked the restroom, he's not in there. I checked the bed, under it, the closet, he's not there either. So as I'm walking down the stairs, he's coming up the stairs. He had boots on, a leather jacket, sweats, and gloves. He was holding a knife and he had a big trash bag with him. I was like, Mike, what are you doing? He says, oh, I just didn't want to wake you up, but I was getting ready to take the trash out early. Him having a knife did not make sense to me, so I turned around and I took off running upstairs. He then screamed, let me explain, while he was trying to stab me. I jumped out of the window in the bathroom, then later, once I got home, I found out his name wasn't even Mike and he was a serial killer. Story time about how I found out my mom faked her death so she wouldn't have to be our parent anymore. So it was me and my brother Jeremy, and after I turned about 5, my mom started complaining that she was getting sick and couldn't go back to work. She was always bedridden and she was always having people make food for us, and she was just never really attentive like that. So here and there she would have this random black car come pull up to the house, and she always told us that she was going to appointments. So that's what we believed. She would come back and just keep us posted and say that the doctor gave her a prescription and that she should be fine. As the years went on, me and my brother Jeremy, who was younger than me, he was 12 and I was 15 at this time, we just started taking care of her for the rest of our lives. We barely had a social life or really any social skills or normal high school experience because we felt like our mom could die any second. And she would always tell us, don't you notice how much weight I'm losing? Because the clothes that she would wear were really big. So one morning, that same black car came and got her and she went to the hospital and she never came back, like for part 2. This is part 2 about how my mom faked her own death. So like I said in part 1, that black car came and supposedly took her to the hospital, but she never came back. So of course, me and my younger brother Jeremy were curious about why she wasn't coming back. So after a whole week of our aunt babysitting us, we kept asking her, where's our mom? And she looked so uncomfortable and cringy every time she told us that, oh, she's still in the hospital. So it's officially been 2 weeks and my aunt got a weird phone call in the middle of the night. She woke up me and my little brother Jeremy and told us that our mom had passed away from an unknown disease. So only about 5 to 10 minutes after me and Jeremy were crying, our aunt went to her bedroom. I dropped out of school and everything because it just made me depressed that my entire life my mom was sick. So some time later, I asked my aunt about the funeral and she said that she was going to be cremated, so there would be no funeral. So after my mother was cremated, my aunt kept the urn locked in a cabinet and said we weren't allowed to touch it ever. This gets bad, like for part 3. Part 3 about how my mama fakes her own death. So like I said in part 2, we weren't allowed to touch the urn. My aunt kept it locked away in a cabinet. I was 15 at the time, but as some years went on, I turned 18 and I just wanted to see it. After all, it was my mom's. So one day, for some reason, I just couldn't sleep and I was staying up extremely late. I heard my aunt getting ready to leave the house, so I decided to stay up to see where she was going. I looked out of the window and the same mysterious black car that used to pick my mom up when I was 5 came to pick her up. That was weird. So after she left, I started looking around through all of her mail, all of her clothes for that key. So I found the key to the urn and I went to the urn, unlocked it, and you will never guess what I found in there. It was flour. It wasn't even ashes. She put flour in the urn. That's why we weren't allowed to touch it. Once I got used to my aunt's schedule, I followed her next time. So as I'm spying through this weird house, I see my aunt talking to my mom. Once I screamed at both of them for a good hour, I found out that my mom paid my aunt to pretend that she was dead. She wanted a fresh start at life, but instead went to jail. Creepy baby story time. So Jonathan and Marie were high school sweethearts who later got married and tried to have kids. They had been trying for 5 whole years and she miscarried 3 times. After a while, they were about to look into adoption because it was just taking too much work. Then they tried praying and seeing a specialist, a counselor, because it was making their marriage pretty tough. After the doctors telling her something was wrong with her reproductive system, they went home and just cried. A week later, she started feeling weird cramps in her stomach. She went to the hospital because she just didn't think she could have been pregnant after all those tries. But when the doctor said she was pregnant, she almost passed out in disbelief and excitement. She went home, and when her husband got off work, she couldn't wait to tell him the great news. They were crying with happiness. So as time went on, they started going to the doctor, getting regular checkups, and everything was going all right. Then at a certain time, the baby was supposed to be bigger than it actually was, and they told them that the baby wasn't growing at a proper speed. They had her take certain vitamins and told her not to worry, like for part 2. Part 2, creepy baby story time. So like I said in part 1, she started taking vitamins just to make sure everything went properly. So about 6 months into her pregnancy, she was just frightened because that baby was not big enough. For some reason, the doctors kept telling her that she had nothing to worry about, so she just took their word for it. She didn't want to overstress because stress isn't good for pregnant women. For some reason, after those 6 months, the baby really started to pick up speed and grow at a normal pace. So boom, delivery day was here. It was time for her to give birth. So delivery day comes, she pushes the baby out, everything seems normal, takes his first breath, and they're excited. So eventually the mom goes and takes a nap with the baby. Jonathan also slept at the hospital with them. So they woke up to this weird noise from the baby. It wasn't crying, but it was just weird. The baby was speaking English. It was saying mommy. The baby was speaking and it had just been born. 2 weeks later, that baby took his first step. Long story short, this baby graduated high school at 13, and it was me. This story time is about how my boss tried to kill me. So I was about 26 years old, had my degree from college, and was starting this brand new office job. Unfortunately, I had to relocate, therefore I had no family there. So on the very first day, I get my office. So I'm settling in, and my boss walks in. He introduced himself as Mr. Seacrest, but told me I could call him Jerry, which was his first name. No lie, that was a little weird because I just met the man. So as I get my first set of papers to work on, I notice that he keeps walking by my window, so I just casually kept waving at him. A little while later, somebody else walks by my window, and I kind of thought it was him, but it was a woman this time. She knocked on my door and asked if she could come in. I was like, yeah, sure. So she walks in, introduces herself. Her name was Sandy, and she was like, you want to go on lunch together? So I was like, of course, let's go. So once we get to lunch, she starts filling me in on people, the hot news, and all the gossip. Then she asks, so who's your boss? I said, Jerry. She goes, Mr. Seacrest? I'm like, oh yeah, him. Like for part 2. This is part 2 about how my boss tried to kill me. So like I said in part 1, I went on lunch with Sandy. She's filling me in on everything, and boom. I tell her that, yeah, I know Mr. Seacrest. She goes, oh, so I'm assuming he said you could call him by his first name too, huh? I'm like, yeah, that's kind of weird. Does he always do that? She says, yeah, but only to the girls he's trying to get to know personally, if you know what I mean. I'm not really into sleeping with my boss, so I wasn't with it. So then she tells me about the story with this girl named Marla that used to work there and got fired. She goes, yeah, Mr. Seacrest, he was interested in her as well. But the girl thought that if they got closer, then she'd get promoted. It turns out he started to get really aggressive, follow her around, and make sure she wasn't talking to any of the other employees, aka the males. Once she started to become afraid of him, she tried to report him. Once he got word that she was trying to get rid of him, he got her fired. In the middle of her telling me this story, I see Mr. Seacrest walking up. I say, change the topic, like for part 3. Part 3 about how my boss tried to kill me. So as Mr. Seacrest, or Jerry, walks up, I tell her to change the topic quick. So she says, okay, well, that was all I wanted to tell you. I have to go. So Mr. Seacrest comes up to me. He sits in her spot. He says, hey, I'd like to take you to lunch and just talk over your new position with you. Now, honestly, since I didn't know the girl who was telling me this story, I wasn't taking it word for word. So I went to lunch with him to talk things over. He was very funny. We exchanged numbers. So me and Mr. Seacrest went out to lunch a few more times, and one lunch got kind of weird. He says, okay, so now that we know each other very well, I was thinking I'd ask you something. He asked me to do him a favor, if you know what I mean. I told him how I felt like that was inappropriate and I would like to get back to work. Then he says, well, I'm your boss, so you won't have any work if you don't do what I'm asking. I try to get out of his car, then he locks the doors. So I say, okay, whatever you want. Just bring me back to my job, please. As soon as he brings me back, I jump out of the car and I jump into mine and speed off. Then he starts chasing me, trying to run me off of the highway. He crashes me and almost tips me over. I was then able to call the police. They tracked him down and arrested him. Story time about how my crazy neighbors ate my dog. By the way, this is an anonymous story from a follower. So me and my boyfriend had just bought our first house together. Everyone welcomed us to the new neighborhood, but we didn't have neighbors to the right side of us yet. No one was in the house yet. So about 6 months into us living there, we get our brand new neighbors. So obviously, since we've been there for 6 months, we introduced ourselves to them. So our neighbors were these 2 grown men. They didn't even have any furniture in their house, so that kind of stood out. We thought later they'd get moving trucks and move in some furniture, but they never did. So me and my boyfriend had a Pomeranian named Chippy. Sometimes we would let our dog go outside to use the restroom, and every time I went outside to get the dog, I noticed our neighbors were just staring at me. So one day I let Chippy go outside to use the restroom, and when I was ready to bring him back in, I couldn't find him anywhere. So I'm looking around, I'm literally looking everywhere, and he is nowhere to be found. So I go back into the house to tell my boyfriend, and then a few minutes later we get a knock on the door. And it's both of our neighbors like, hey, we found your dog in your front yard. Like for part 2. Part 2 story time about how my crazy neighbors ate my dog. By the way, this is an anonymous story. So after our neighbors bring by our dog, we started to get suspicious for sure. Things just weren't adding up at all. So one day a kid across the street saw our dog Chippy and wanted to play with him. So I said, of course, only if you make sure nothing happens. Obviously, I didn't think anything would happen. That kid loved our dog. So as the kid is playing with our dog Chippy, the neighbors are looking out of the window watching him. So they come outside of their house and they go, hey, can I play with him? And the boy says, yeah, but you can't let anything happen to him. Then our neighbor goes, oh, of course not. I play with Chippy all the time. The boy then goes, okay, well, I have to go home now. Make sure Chippy gets back to his owner. He says, of course, nothing's going to happen to Chippy. So the boy goes back into his house, and our neighbors bring Chippy inside of their house. So after about an hour or so, I go outside to see what's going on. Chippy is missing yet again. Like for part 3. Part 3 story time about how my neighbors ate my dog. So once I go outside to look for my dog, I notice he's not there and neither was the kid. So I go to the kid's house across the street to see if maybe he brought the dog home. Then he says, no, I gave him to your neighbors. He said he'd give him back to you. My stomach dropped because I do not trust my neighbors. So I go to my neighbor's house and I'm banging on the door and they don't answer. So I go get my boyfriend. Then he comes out and he's banging on the door demanding that they come out. They never answer. So we call the police. Once the police are called, they get there and they bang on the door and then they answer. The police noticed that they had no furniture and the lights were off, so they became suspicious. A second police officer pulls up and he claims that he recognizes them. And he tells me that they're two homeless men. They don't even actually live there. They broke in. As they were looking around in the house, they found Chippy's collar and they also found remains of a dog, meaning they ate our dog. That explains why they kept watching him. They were arrested on many charges. Best/worst date ever. So I was in a relationship with this guy who was very emotionally/physically abusive sometimes. He was so insecure, like literally anytime I was even on my phone, he would take it from me just to see what was keeping my attention. So one day this guy DMs me and he's telling me how beautiful I am and how much he'd like to get to know me. After exchanging messages with him a few times, I could tell he had pure intentions. I felt so guilty but so afraid because I didn't want my original boyfriend to find out. He would have tried to kill me. So instead of DMing, I told him to just email me so it'd be less suspicious. So after talking for a few weeks, I tried to call things off because I was catching real feelings for him. He made me feel so much better than my boyfriend ever did. So once I told him the type of person that I was and how bad I'd feel for cheating on my boyfriend, I called things off. By the way, his name was Carter, and my boyfriend's name was Jackson. So some weeks went by without me speaking to Carter, and Valentine's Day came up. So Jackson takes me to this fancy restaurant. Once we're seated, I recognize someone there, like for part 2. Part 2 about my best/worst date ever. By the way, this is an anonymous story. So once me and Jackson get seated, I recognize this guy. I can only see the side of his face, but he definitely looked familiar. So every so often I would look over there to see if I recognized him from somewhere. So as I was looking at him one other time, he looked at me and we caught eye contact for a split second. Then it hit me. It was Carter. Carter was the guy who DM'd me, and he's literally at the same restaurant as I am. So Jackson starts to notice that I'm distracted by something and he's looking behind him trying to see who I'm looking at. So he goes, "Why the F are you looking around the restaurant for? I'm your boyfriend. I took you on this date and you're being so ungrateful." So as Jackson's trying to see who I'm looking at, Carter turns around and looks at me again. And he goes, "Are you okay?" Jackson then goes, "Are you making eyes at this guy?" And he takes his whole drink and throws it in my face. He stands up making a scene, yelling and cursing at me. So Carter came over there, like for part 3. Part 3 about my worst/best date ever. By the way, this story is anonymous. So once Carter comes over there to see if I'm okay, Jackson stands up ready to fight him. So the girl that Carter was sitting with runs over there. And she goes, "Who is this girl and why are you trying to fight for her?" Carter simply says she's in trouble and her boyfriend is treating her like crap. So she goes, "Well, if you care more about her, then you can just be with her." Then she leaves. So Carter and Jackson get into a fight and they're on top of the table, slamming the food everywhere. I got salad on me, drinks on me, everything, you name it. So after the waiter split us up, they put everybody out. After we were out, Carter demanded that I get in his car and not in Jackson's. Jackson threatened to kill me if I got in his car, so Carter called the police. Once the police showed up, Jackson was arrested for threatening my life. Once me and Carter sat in his car for hours, we were connecting with everything. I honestly hadn't been that happy in forever. Long story short, that story was 2 years ago, and we're going to tell it to our soon-to-be-born child. Storytime about how I shot my boyfriend's eggplant. I was a sophomore in college at this time with my boyfriend Michael and my best friend Serenity. One day my best friend Serenity buzzed down my college dorm room and was crying hysterically. She was telling me she just came back from the doctors and got terrible news. Her boyfriend Brad cheated on her and gave her herpes. She felt so embarrassed and I promised her I wouldn't tell anybody. So I told my boyfriend that Serenity was starting to have relationship problems and we should probably be there for her more. So every now and then Michael would say, "Hey babe, I'm going to go check on Serenity," and he would hang out with her by herself, which I had absolutely no problem with. But then later on, they start to hang out without me, without even telling me that they were hanging out. I honestly felt like I had nothing to worry about knowing the circumstances. And my boyfriend, he was not a cheater. So I thought. So one day I was taking a shower, and as I was washing down there, stuff started to burn. I hopped out of the shower and sat on the toilet to take a good look, and I had bumps. These were not razor bumps, they were bumps. So I went to my doctor immediately, like for part 2. This is part 2 about how I shot my boyfriend's eggplant. So like I said in part 1, I went to the doctors so quick. Once they tested me for everything, they told me that I should have my results in about 2 to 3 days. 2 to 3 days later exactly, I got my results. I had herpes. Once I read that I tested positive, I knew exactly where it came from. So I called my boyfriend and I said, "Hey, where are you?" He goes, "Oh, I was just checking on Serenity again." I said, "Okay, well, I'm going to go to class now." I was lying. I was on my way to see what the hell they were doing. So once I get to Serenity's, I bust down the door and you guessed it, they were doing it. So Michael hops off Serenity trying to run to me. apologizing, babe, I'm so sorry. I had my dad's gun and I shot his eggplant. I was just like, you won't be needing that anymore, because boo, you got herpes. He would have never slept with her if he knew she had herpes, but that just exposed the fact that he's a cheater. Oh, and for Serenity, I whooped that ass. Herpes was the last thing she was worried about. If my life was going to be ruined, then so was theirs. Story time about how I slept with my own dad. By the way, this story is anonymous. Now, keep in mind, I never knew who my dad was from birth, but I knew he lived in the same state as me. So I was a senior in college, and it was getting so hard for me to graduate. So one day I went in early to speak with our professor about the homework, and we had a new professor. I was so upset because our other professor was so lenient with me. He understood everything. I was going to have to catch this new dude up on everything. I was hoping he wasn't strict, but just like I thought, he was extremely strict. He went by Professor Tom, which was his first name because he said it made him feel old to go by his last. So graduation started coming up, and I was talking to my best friend like, girl, what should I do? I was failing so many of my classes. It was just so hard. Then when I told her we had a new professor, she was like, oh, girl, you screwed. So once me and her got to class the next day, she was like, oh, girl, he is cute. She's like, you know what you're going to have to do by the end of the semester if you're still failing, right? Like for part 2. Part 2 story time about how I slept with my biological father. By the way, this story is very anonymous. So my best friend was suggesting that I had to sleep with him to pass my classes. I did not want to take it there, but by the way my grades was looking, I had no choice. So I asked him to start tutoring me after classes. He agreed to tutor me, and I got a lot closer to him. So one day I came in for tutoring, and I locked the door. I told him I had a surprise for him just to show appreciation for him helping me. He was like, and what is that? Long story short, we did the do on his desk. We both had a great time. After that, my grades were not a problem. So the next day I was freaking out telling my best friend everything that happened. And she was kind of happy for me. So after classes, I went home and my mom told me my dad was coming over for dinner. She was like, honey, he's moved closer to us so he can get closer to you. She goes, he actually just started teaching at your college. My stomach hit the floor. So I hear someone knock on the door and I am sweating. She opens the door. It's my professor. I blacked out and I don't remember anything after that. Story time about how I found out my dad was a racist. This story is anonymous. I have no idea where my dad is. So all my life I went to all white schools, and I mean all white. But my freshman year of high school, there was this one black guy there, and his name was Terrell. He was so fine. All of the girls thought he was cute, but they didn't want to be judged by the white boys for dating a black guy. There was so much racism in my school, it was disgusting. So I wanted to make him more comfortable, so I introduced myself to him and started hanging out with him. As we got to know each other, we started to like each other, and he asked me to be his girlfriend. I did not hesitate to say yes because I was not concerned about my parents not liking him. So one day after school, I went home and I announced to my parents the big news. So I brought them in the living room, sat them down, and I told them I had a boyfriend. They were so happy for me, but my dad was like, who's the guy? So I go, his name is Terrell, and before I could finish, my dad's like, Terrell? So he's a black guy? I'm like, yeah. He's like, okay, cool, bring him over for dinner. Like for part 2. This is part 2 story time about how I found out my dad was a racist. This story is anonymous. So after my dad was like, oh, so he's black? That definitely stood out to me. I'm like, why did you say it like that? He's like, oh, I just want to recognize the guy who's dating my daughter. I was like, okay. So the next weekend I bring Terrell over for dinner. My dad is eyeing him down like a hawk, but I thought he was just being a typical dad. So after dinner was over, everything went pretty smoothly. My dad then goes, hey Terrell, let's go for a walk man to man. Terrell looks at me with fear in his eyes, only because he's my dad. So my dad goes in the basement and gets his backpack with some stuff in it. Then they head outside. 15 minutes later, Terrell's texting me like, you need to come quick. Something is wrong with your dad and I'm not comfortable. It took me about 10 minutes to get there, and once I got there, they were behind some trees in a park. Before I even got there, I could hear N-word this and N-word that. As soon as I located them, I saw my dad on top of Terrell, telling him he would never be good enough for me. I kicked my dad so hard in the balls. I could not believe my dad was this way. I grabbed Terrell and we ran. I left home and stayed with him and his parents, who've been together ever since.
So I'm from a small coastal town where my family's been for generations. We live really close to a harbor. My grandmother once told me an insane story about a fisherman, Bill, who used to fish out of the harbor like 60 years ago. And he had a reputation for being really creepy. One time when my grandmother was a teenager, she went to the harbor and asked if she could buy striped bass from Bill. And he responded, "Only if you show me your left tit." And when she told him he was a repulsive pig, he was like, "Oh, come on, I was just joking." And that's how he would act towards women. He was vulgar and disgusting, but people put up with it because they thought he wasn't actually dangerous or threatening. Except one morning, my grandmother went to the fish market with her friend Felicity, who was visiting for the summer. They were both 17 at the time, and according to my grandmother, Felicity was extremely beautiful, but also very innocent and shy. When they arrived, Bill was there selling his fish. And my grandmother noticed right away that Bill was fixated on Felicity. He never took his eyes off of her. Later that night, my grandmother and Felicity were going to sleep. They had the windows open and started hearing strange noises outside. They thought it was probably an animal, but they went outside to check. At first, they couldn't find anything, but then my grandmother noticed something across the street that made her stomach drop. So my grandmother and Felicity went outside to investigate the strange noises. And my grandmother noticed a red truck parked across the street. She recognized the truck because she had seen it at the harbor before. It was Bill's truck. My grandmother panicked and told Felicity that they needed to get back inside immediately. She locked the door behind them. A few seconds later, they heard an engine start up, and when they got to the window to look outside, the truck was gone. The girls decided not to tell my grandma's parents because they weren't positive it was actually Bill lurking around the house, and eventually they were able to fall back asleep. A few weeks later, Felicity was walking back from the grocery store alone at dusk. She felt like someone was following her, and when she looked over her shoulder, she saw the same red truck creeping behind her. She dropped the carton of eggs she was carrying and started sprinting, but she could hear the truck pick up speed behind her. When she got back to my grandma's house, she burst through the front door sobbing. That night, they decided it was time to tell my grandma's parents and call the police. But all the cops were local guys who knew Bill and his womanizer reputation. They just rolled their eyes and laughed and said, "Yeah, Bill's a bastard, but he's harmless." And my grandma said that when she heard them say that, she felt sick. They were wrong, and she knew it. Bill was a dangerous man.
So the night of the party, they get all done up to go to the harbor where they're supposed to meet the boat driver who will take them to Graveyard Island. When they get to the harbor, it's dark and they don't see anyone. They waited for a while. My grandma starts looking around. She glances at Felicity's face. She can tell that Felicity is starting to get worried. You know, the harbor doesn't feel like the safest place for them because it's obviously Bill's stomping ground. But then they hear the sound of a group of kids coming towards them. They're all a little tipsy. They're also headed to Graveyard Island's bar. And then they hear the motor of a small boat round the corner of the harbor's jetty, and that's the boat that's there to pick them up and shuttle them to the island. When the boat got to the dock, they all hop in the boat and they go to Graveyard Island. When my grandmother and Felicity enter the bar, people are already very clearly well on their way to a big fun night. One guy is dancing on the table, a lot of people are taking shots. It's a bright, festive energy in the room. And my grandma and Felicity are immediately psyched that they're here. They're happy they came. It's kind of a crazy scene, but it's also super fun. Then the door to the bar swings open and my grandmother does a double take. Her stomach drops and she looks at Felicity to see if she's watching the same thing, and Felicity is. Bill has just entered the bar and he's immediately scanned the room and found Felicity. My grandmother asked Felicity if she wants to leave, but Felicity all of a sudden looks really determined and she says, "No, this is the most fun we've been having all summer. We're not gonna let this loser ruin it for us." Plus, the bar is super crowded, so Felicity feels like she's in control and can keep a safe distance from Bill and have the buffer of a bunch of bodies in between them. So that's what they do. The girls keep having a fun night. Felicity, of course, is on edge. She keeps glancing over her shoulder, keeping tabs on where Bill is, but they manage to keep having a good time. She always has a good distance between her and Bill. My grandmother's also keeping an eye on Bill, watching his every move out of the corner of her eye. She notices that he's drinking heavily. Every time she looks at him, he's taking another shot of whiskey, looking at the girls with menacing eyes. Then she sees Bill stagger towards the bathroom and disappear behind the bathroom doors. My grandmother relaxes for a moment, knowing that Bill is out of range. And Felicity leans into my grandmother's ear and tells her she's gonna get them both another beer from the bar. Felicity disappears into the crowd of people. The next thing my grandmother hears is a woman's yelp and a man's voice saying, "What the fuck, you stupid bitch?" My grandma pushes through the sea of people and sees Felicity crying and Bill clenching Felicity's wrist violently. My grandma immediately steps in between them and tells Bill to let go of Felicity immediately, which he finally does. And then the bar owner shows up and he asks what the problem is, and Felicity explains what happened. She had been ordering a drink and all of a sudden Bill came up behind her and started groping her and grabbed both of her breasts. Instinctually, she spun around and slapped him to push him away, and that's when he grabbed her wrist. Bill's pretty hammered during this whole incident, and while Felicity's explaining the situation to the bar owner, he's just repeating in slurred words. His eyes are half open. "The bitch slapped me, the bitch slapped me." My grandmother's listening to Felicity's story and she's appalled, but she's grateful the bar owner showed up because at least he'll kick Bill out and they can maybe rebound and keep having a fun night. But that's not what happens. Instead, the bar owner chuckles, shakes his head, looks at Felicity and says, "Sorry, lady, that's the cost of having a pretty face like yours." And then he nods at Bill, who's barely able to stand up straight, and he says, Where a man puts his hands is a man's private business. My grandmother could not believe what the bar owner was saying. A man's private business? This doesn't make any sense. Clearly it's not private business if it's affecting Felicity and other people in the bar. But on the other hand, my grandmother's not surprised that the bar owner isn't going to be doing anything about Bill. Other people, especially men, had been turning a blind eye to Bill's disgusting behavior for years. He never faced any repercussions. My grandmother knew Bill's reputation as this creepy misogynist since she was a little girl. Her mother would complain about Bill every time she got back from the fish market. And clearly no one had the wherewithal to do anything about him, evident by the fact that he stuck around for so long. So in a way, the bar owner was just like the police officers and everyone else in the town who decided to be bystanders to Bill's threatening behavior. After the bar owner announced that Bill was basically faultless and that he wasn't going to be kicking Bill out, Felicity started sobbing and stormed out of the bar. People always advised against leaving the bar on the island alone because even though the island was small, the terrain was super rough and rocky and could be very dangerous at night. And on one side of the island, there was a 30-foot cliff, so if you weren't careful, you could fall, especially when it's dark at night. My grandmother, knowing this, followed after Felicity immediately. She started shouting Felicity's name, but it was windy, so her voice kept being taken by the wind. She checked the dock on the island where the shuttle boat picked and dropped people off, but when she got there, it was just the boat driver alone on the dock, smoking a cigarette alone. He said that he hadn't seen anyone come by for the past 2 hours. My grandmother keeps searching all over the island, but as I said, it's pretty small, so there's not many places she can look. My grandmother can't find Felicity anywhere. Then my grandmother hears a splash, like someone jumping off the island's cliff into the water, and she screams Felicity's name and runs towards the edge of the cliff. And then the clouds slowly uncover the moon, and the luminous blue light of moonlight reveals that it is in fact Felicity in the water. She's now swam towards the edge of the cliff and is climbing up the rock wall, getting out of the water. Once Felicity is safely on top of the island, my grandmother freaks out. She's like, Felicity, what were you doing? The currents are so strong at night down there, and not to mention, you know people say that this water's infested with hammerheads. Felicity goes, oh, I didn't know that. She's totally blasé about the whole situation, which my grandmother finds really weird. She's usually quiet, but even quieter in this moment. All she does is shrug and say, sorry, I just had to collect my thoughts. In that moment, my grandmother claims that she knew something was off with Felicity. There was something different in her eyes, like she was ready to do unprecedented things for revenge. My grandmother assumes they're just gonna go home after that. First of all, Felicity is drenched in water, and also Creepy Bill is still lurking in the bar, so why would they go back to the bar? But Felicity insists on going back. She claims that there is still, quote, fun to be had, in a very monotone, creepy voice. As soon as the girls walk back into the bar, Felicity does something that surprises my grandmother entirely. She walks directly up to Bill and she starts flirting with him. She's like leaning into him, giggling. She's tracing her hand up and down his arm. My grandmother can't believe what she's looking at, and she can tell Bill seems almost just as surprised as my grandmother is. He's definitely shit-faced, but he is loving Felicity's attention. My grandmother's actually pretty disturbed by this though, so she goes up to them and tries to intervene, but Felicity physically pushes her away and says, excuse me, you're interrupting a conversation here. My grandmother just keeps watching them from like 10 feet away. She's in shock. She really doesn't know what to do. And then she sees Felicity lean in for a kiss, and all of a sudden, Bill and Felicity are making out in front of everyone at the bar. Just as this is happening, the bar owner walks by my grandmother and says, see? She was into it the whole time. She was probably asking for it. My grandmother goes, no, she wasn't. This guy is disgusting. And the bar owner responds, clearly your friend doesn't think so. My grandmother is embarrassed for both herself and Felicity and decides she needs to put an end to this. So she goes up to them a second time, more stern and aggressive, and says, Felicity, what are you doing? I want to go home. Let's go. This man is disgusting. We're leaving. But Felicity looks my grandmother directly in the eyes and she says, go home yourself. I'm staying here with Bill. My grandmother just stares at her friend, shocked. And Bill, from the side, slurs, you heard her. My grandmother is now pissed, so she says, Felicity, this is your last chance. I'm leaving right now. She points at Bill. This guy's a fucking creep and you know it. Go away. Felicity responds. My grandmother was so confused, but she knew in her heart, that Felicity was up to something. It was too unbelievable that she was suddenly attracted to Bill. But my grandmother leaves, she gets in the shuttle boat and she heads home. She's full of mixed emotions. She feels kind of guilty for leaving Felicity on one hand, but she's also really angry at her friend who's kind of abandoned her as well. It is, after all, 1 a.m. It's an appropriate time to call it a night and go home. My grandmother goes to sleep, and she wakes up to the noise of her bedroom door opening, and she sees Felicity tiptoeing in. She looks out the window and she can see the sun's rising at this point, that birds are chirping, and she glances at her watch and she sees that it's 5:30 in the morning. Felicity was out all night. The next morning is pretty awkward between my grandmother and Felicity. They're not really talking much. My grandmother doesn't really ask for that many details about the night before because, quite honestly, she doesn't really want to know them, but when she does ask for little tidbits, Felicity isn't particularly forthcoming either. She doesn't divulge much. Later that day, my grandmother runs into some friends who were also at the Graveyard Island bar the night night before, and they tell her that they saw Bill and Felicity leave the bar together, but those are the only details she gets. A few days later, my grandmother's mom asks her to go to the Harbor's fish market to buy some cod for dinner that night. My grandmother goes alone on her walk there. She gets ready to be repulsed by Bill, but when she gets there, Bill isn't at the fish market. At first she doesn't say anything, but then her curiosity gets the best of her, and she asks one of the other fishermen where Bill is, and he shrugs and says, "We haven't seen Bill since the weekend. We think he's sick or something, but we haven't heard from him." For the rest of the week, Bill doesn't show up for work. A couple of the fishermen think it's odd, but no one goes looking for him. Bill wasn't a very likable guy, so he didn't have any close friends who would check in on him if he didn't show up to work for a few days. No one was particularly worried about Bill's well-being. But then, the following Monday, Bill doesn't show up for work again, and people start to get suspicious. A few of the fishermen go to Bill's house and look inside, and no one's there. Then they go to the police and inform the police that they believe Bill has gone missing. The police open a formal investigation. The police interview several people who were with Bill the night before, including Felicity. All of the people tell the police that the last place they saw Bill was partying at the bar on Graveyard Island. Felicity tells the police that she was with him on Graveyard Island, and they actually boated back to the mainland together, but once they got to the harbor, Felicity told him she was going home and assumed that he was also going to his own home. So they went their separate ways after they got back to the harbor. The investigation lasts a couple months, but they don't really get any answers, so the police conclude that he probably just left town and took off to somewhere else. Maybe he wanted to start fresh in a new place with no strings attached. It's not like he had a particularly good reputation here. The police stop their investigation. It becomes a cold case. A year later, a visiting fisherman is fishing off of Graveyard Island, and he gets a hammerhead shark stuck in his net. Usually when a shark gets stuck in a fisherman's net, they try to save it so that it can swim away, but this shark was so tangled that it actually choked on the net and died. The fisherman took it back to the harbor. When he got there, he cut it open and noticed that there was something shiny in its intestines. He looked closer and saw that it was a watch. A few of the other local fishermen come over to look at the shark, and one of them recognizes the watch. It was Bill's watch. Bill would always brag about how the watch was worth $300, which everyone knew was bullshit. Bill could never afford a $300 watch. He spent all of his money on booze. They bring the watch to the police station, and the police are relieved to receive it as a piece of evidence because they use it to finally close the case. They conclude that the night that Bill went missing, he must have been drunkenly lingering at the harbor after Felicity had left him, fallen into the ocean, and gotten attacked by a hammerhead. They're still slightly confused why they never found the rest of his remains at the harbor the next day or the weeks that followed, but they figured this is the only plausible explanation for why Bill disappeared. My grandmother always said that there was one person the police never interviewed during their investigation, the boat driver who shuttled people back and forth from Graveyard Island the night that Bill went missing. At the time, the boat driver knew the investigation was going on, but he especially hated Bill for the way he was known to treat women. It was the 1950s after all, and it wasn't particularly cool to be a feminist back then, but this boat driver was one. So when he found out that Bill went missing, he really didn't give a shit. Unless the police asked him for information, he wasn't going to take time out of his day to go there and help them with the investigation. The boat driver knew that Bill made women feel uncomfortable literally every single day, so if he was missing, maybe that was a good thing for the town. As years went by, my grandmother actually grew to become friends with the boat driver, whose name is Tom. My grandmother and Tom remained good friends until old age. Tom sadly passed away before my grandmother when he was 73. However, according to my grandmother, there was one night when Tom and she were having kind of a boozy night together. They were drinking, sharing stories, and the topic of Bill's disappearance came up. They were bonding about how awful Bill was. And then all of a sudden, Tom lowered his voice, leaned into my grandmother's ear and said, "You know, the night that Bill went missing, I drove Felicity back from Graveyard Island, and she was not with Bill. She was all alone." And my grandmother and Tom looked at each other, and they were thinking the exact same thing. That was not the story that Felicity told the police. She had told them that she was last with him at the harbor, after they had returned from the island. Since that discovery, my grandmother has wondered a lot about what really happened the night that Bill went missing. The theory she believes in most is this. Felicity decided to seduce Bill that night because she was really luring him into a trap. When they left the bar that night, instead of going directly to the shuttle boat, Felicity suggested that they go to the island's cliff to look out at the moon. While Bill drunkenly gazed at the moon with his barely functional brain cells, Felicity pushed him off the cliff. He probably yelled, "You stupid bitch," as he fell into his cold, saltwater death, but his misogyny was not going to save him at that point. And Felicity knew this, so she was unbothered by his final words to her. After Felicity pushed Bill into his doom, she casually got onto the shuttle boat with Tom, where she was delivered back to the mainland. She then walked home and crawled into the twin bed next to my grandmother's at 5:30 in the morning. When the police asked Felicity about Bill's disappearance the following week, Felicity feigned ignorance. But that was just my grandmother's theory. She never knew what really happened. My grandmother and Felicity actually remained friends well into their old age, but my grandmother never felt it was appropriate to ask Felicity for the truth. Because, after all, what a lady does late at night is a lady's private business. 5 years ago, my parents bought a farm in rural Tennessee. And the summer after they bought it, they told my brother and I that we had to work on the farm. And I was like, oh, but I want a summer internship in New York City. And they were like, oh, that's nice, but you're going to be weed whacking in rural Tennessee. So in Tennessee, there are these snakes called copperheads. And I'm from the East Coast, and we don't have copperheads on the East Coast. So these snakes are really bad. And I know they're bad because people talk shit about them. People never want to say bad things about animals. Like even sharks. Like a shark could bite a woman's leg off, and everyone would be like, oh, that poor shark thought she was a seal, so it's kind of her fault, you know? It's kind of on her. And we stand with the shark. And actually the shark's name is Teddy. He's been followed by marine biologists since he was just a baby. But people definitely say bad things about these snakes in Tennessee, these copperheads, because they're ruthless. You know, with predatory animals, how people are like, if you don't bother it, it won't bother you. That's apparently not the case with these copperheads. I was talking to my neighbor one day, this guy Rick. He's a big pink man. I mean, he's a white man, but his face is bright pink. He goes, oh yeah, be vigilant because these snakes can kill you. If they see you, they will attack. So I had been in Tennessee for like a month and I hadn't seen one of these snakes yet. And this one day it was so hot and I was wearing khaki shorts that day and I had the worst ass crack sweat stain I have ever had. Like if you ever Googled swass, sweaty ass, that day my butt would have been the Wikipedia image for it. So I was so hot and I had to go for a swim. So I went to the creek alone. I'm driving there and I just had this bad feeling, like I knew something bad was gonna happen. So I go to the creek to cool off for what my mom would call a dippy-do. A dippy-do means going for a swim, for those of you who don't know. It's the middle of the day and I'm the only person at the creek when I arrive. So I'm just getting in the water, I'm like ankle deep and another car pulls up. And before I even looked, I could tell from the sound of the muffler that I wasn't gonna love the person behind the wheel of that car. And sure enough, I turn around to look and the vehicle has a big old Confederate flag sticker on the back. And the guy who gets out, he's not pink like my neighbor Rick. He's red, like a chili pepper that gives you horrible diarrhea. So I avoid eye contact, obviously. I don't want to engage with a man who has a Confederate flag sticker on the back of his truck. So then the man starts walking into the water, and at this point, I'm already fully submerged halfway across the creek. And as he's getting in, I see something pop up in the water between us. A little dark head with tiny beady eyes. My first copperhead sighting. And this snake looked at me, and then he looked at him, and then he disappeared under the water again before I can even say anything. So I have a moment of panic because I have no idea where this snake is going. And it happens so fast, the next thing I hear is the red man screaming that he got bit by a copperhead. He ended up being okay, and I'm not saying that anyone deserves to get bit by a poisonous snake. But that snake is an ally.
This story time is about how my friends tried to drown me. By the way, this story is anonymous. So my dad's job relocated him, and that meant we had to go to a new school. I was trying so hard to fit in, I ended up finding the wrong crowd. First day comes around and I'm at lunch. And this boy named Raul comes up to me asking me if I'm doing okay. So we start chatting it up and I notice these 5 girls see us at the table. We walk up to the table and just interrupt our conversation and say, hey girl. Then this one blonde girl named Sarah asked me, do you know him? Like, no, I just met him. And she's like, well, I see that you're new, so you can hang out with us, okay? I was so happy because I had a group of friends on the first day. Sometime later, me and Raul start to like each other. I told my new friends who I liked. And Sarah, which was the queen bee of the group, she goes, so you guys are liking each other? I was like, yeah. She goes, well, I mean, that was my ex, but, you know, who cares? I'm like, girl, I don't have to have him. Like for part 2. Part 2 story time about how my friends tried to drown me. By the way, this story is anonymous. That awkward little moment with Sarah, some weeks went by. So she finds me by my locker and she goes, hey girl, Raul is letting us borrow his boat for the weekend. Want to come out with us? I'm like, of course I want to go out. Are you kidding me? The following weekend comes for us to go and she goes, oh, and make sure you don't bring a bathing suit. We're just going to be sitting on the boat. Like, okay. The day comes and we're all excited and we're cruising out there. So we get damn near in the middle of the sea and Sarah turns off the boat. Everyone's looking at me. She goes, "So you like Raul, huh?" I'm like, "Sarah, what's going on?" She goes, "What kind of friend are you? What kind of friend takes their best friend's boyfriend?" I'm like, "First of all, we're not best friends. And second of all, he's not your boyfriend." And her friends then throw me out of the boat. He then tries to run me over. So I stayed under the water and swam away as fast as I could. I got to the land, I called Raul. Once he came and got me, we reported them and they all got expelled.
Story time about how my parents found out I was gay. By the way, this story is anonymous and it's from a boy's perspective. Now, I like boys since I was about 6 years old, and all through school I always felt like something was wrong with me. I was so ashamed and so embarrassed of myself. My dad was completely against LGBTQ, and my mom just kept all of her opinions to herself. So when I was about 17 years old in high school, I was finally ready to start dating somebody. I was just so tired of all my girlfriends talking about all the guys they date. So they encouraged me to finally step up and talk to somebody. So I got a Tinder and I finally started talking to this one boy who went to another school. Everything was going perfect, so we planned to meet up at a mall. Ever since then, we started hanging out and everything was great. My friends accepted me, he accepted me, so I was finally ready for my parents to accept me. So after a while of me and this boy dating, I finally told him I wanted to tell my parents about us. But before I could even tell them, they already found out. Like for part 2, also follow my Instagram. This is part 2 story time about how my parents found out I was gay. This story is anonymous and it's from a boy's perspective. So I got to a point where I definitely wanted to tell my parents I was gay, but honestly, the thought of it totally freaked me out and I changed my mind. But then my boyfriend started to feel like I was ashamed of him. I didn't want him to feel like that anymore, so I told my parents about us. I was going to tell my parents, but just not when he wanted me to. So one morning from school, my boyfriend came to pick me up with Starbucks. He knocked on the door and my dad opened it. He goes, "Hi, is Chris here?" which is my name. He says, "Yes, and who are you?" He says, "I'm William, Chris's boyfriend." My dad tells him to come inside and he calls me downstairs. So once I come downstairs and I see him, my jaw dropped. He says, "Are you gay?" Then William goes, "You didn't tell him?" I said, "I'm so sorry, I meant to." My dad goes, "Spent all this time raising you just so you could turn into a FAG?" Then my dad throws me out the house. William later understood how I felt. My mom later divorced him and brought me back home.
Part 1 story time about how my own mother was preventing me from having kids. This story is anonymous. Not gonna lie, in high school, your girl was kind of fast. My mom and I, we did not have the best relationship. She always called me a whore and she told me she was gonna put me on birth control as soon as she got good insurance. So sooner than later, I was on birth control. I snuck around with all types of dudes. I thought being on birth control gave me a pass to do whatever I wanted. And my mom never stopped me. She just didn't want to be bothered by me. So as some years went on, boom, I was in college. So I met this guy, Jared, and he was perfect. Me and my mother were never close, so she didn't think I changed since high school. So after college was over, I brought Jared home to meet my parents. My mom liked him and everything, but then she pulled me aside and told me something later. My mom then told me, "You need to stay your ass on birth control. I don't care who you meet. Knowing how you are, you might cheat on him and have babies with everybody on campus." That was hurtful, but I already made up my mind to get off. Like for part 2. Part 2 story time about how my mother was preventing me from having kids. This story is anonymous. So I told my mom, no matter what she thought, I made up my mind already. I'm off birth control. So she's like, "Yeah, we'll see about that." I'm like, "We ain't gonna see about nothing. I'm off." So Jared and I decided to stay with my mom until we found jobs, apartments, etc. Due to some things Jared did when he was a teenager, it was making it hard for him to get a job. Long story short, we were there for a few years. As soon as we graduated college, we had been trying to have a baby, and it just wasn't working. I told my mom about it, but she said, "Don't waste your time going to the hospital. The only reason you can't have kids is because you're stressed out." So we kept trying some months later, but after a while I was tired of it. I snuck and went to a hospital. The doctors ran some tests and they then told me I was on a hormonal birth control. I sped my ass home so fast. I told my mom what the doctor told me, and then she confessed that she was crushing it up in my food every day. I had never felt so betrayed. And since that was very much illegal, best believe she went and did time. 6 months later, I was pregnant.